Hello, my name is DeBlieck and I'm here with my colleague Elise Garvey, and we're going to talk about an audit that we did looking at high-risk sheriff's equipment where we found insufficient safeguards that increase the risks of loss, theft, and misuse. The audit focused on the King County Sheriff's Office equipment and supplies that, if not properly controlled, could pose a risk to the public, officer, or the county. The three key takeaways are shown here. First, there are a lot of the items, high-risk items in the Sheriff's Office inventory. Second, the Sheriff's Office is working to control high-risk items in multiple ways, but there's areas where more could be done. And finally, the current gaps may allow these items to slip through and cause harm to officers or the public. Here I'm going to talk briefly about the types of equipment and supplies that fall into this high-risk category. As you can imagine, the types of equipment necessary for police work run the gamut from firearms to boat motors. The images here are some of the things that would fall into our high-risk category. Over there on the left, we have things that are simply dangerous or could pose a threat if they were out in the general public. This includes guns, but also specialty weapon systems like gun sights, suppressors, large capacity magazines, and night vision goggles. In the middle are high-dollar capital items, like the helicopters, boats, and certain specialty capital equipment like the mobile helicopter landing platform shown down there on the bottom. And over here on the right are things that are smaller but still valuable, like boat motors, metal detectors, electronics, and safety equipment. Looking at this picture, you can see with the range of high-risk items out there that a one-size-fits-all approach to safeguards would not be feasible or necessary. Getting to the right set of safeguards for high-risk assets starts with a risk assessment. Conducting a risk assessment starts off with the department answering some key questions like, what do we need to protect and why? And what could happen if we don't protect it? After the risk assessment, the department can put in the appropriate safeguards at the key steps in the life cycle of the item shown here when they buy it and track it while it's in the inventory. Going through these steps in a systematic, comprehensive way helps ensure that not just some items are protected, it gives assurance to management and the public that things do not slip through, either on purpose or by accident. In our audit, we found that the Sheriff's Office has not taken this first step, which means two things. First of all, the controls that are in place may not be sufficient to protect the items, and this could lead to bad outcomes like being unable to deploy because of maintenance issues, sending officers out without proper safety gear, or losing a dangerous item that gets used in a crime. Second, we found that some controls are mismatched. That is, they're overly protective, creating burdensome administrative work that can take officers away from their police duties. Recommendations in this area are for the Sheriff's Office to conduct a risk assessment, which would identify what needs to be protected and also include a review of current controls. Based on this work, we recommend that the Sheriff's Office set up the policies and procedures so that its officers and staff know what needs to be protected and how. Now I'm going to hand it over to Elise, who will cover the other elements of our audit.
As Sean mentioned, conducting the risk assessment helps the Sheriff's Office identify which items are high risk. Once those items are identified, they require additional safeguards to mitigate those risks. And we looked at some types of safeguards in more depth, and the first one I'll talk about here is purchasing, where safeguards should be employed to prevent unauthorized purchases. The Sheriff's control for purchasing is a memo process, which is required for nearly all purchases. The officer submits the memo for approval through the chain of command, and then commanding officers review these memos, and if approved, submit them to the purchasing unit's chief financial officer. Staff stated that this process can take days or months because the paper memo must move from manager to manager, often across multiple locations. And while this level of control could be appropriate for some items that are risky and purchased infrequently, it is inefficient for less risky items, such as boat flags and carabiners. Additionally, because the memo process is lengthy, it does not meet operational needs, particularly immediate needs when officers are in the field and need to purchase important but less risky items, but cannot buy them without circumventing the memo process and buying on store accounts or personal credit, which defeats the purpose of the safeguard as well. So to increase efficiency and better meet operational needs, we recommend that the Sheriff's Office update purchasing policies to align them with risk levels. The other purchasing safeguard we reviewed relate to contract cities. The Sheriff contracts to provide police services to several local cities, and those cities are buying some equipment for the officers, such as rifles, radar guns, and specialty vehicles, which could be considered high-risk equipment. This is a problem because all equipment used by Sheriff employees carries the same potential risks, regardless of ownership. For example, the risk to the community presented by a lost weapon is the same regardless of whether it is owned by the Sheriff or a contract city. This means that King County could potentially be found financially responsible for the misuse of that weapon if it were lost by the Sheriff, even if the item is owned by a contract city. And we found that the contracts between the Sheriff and its contract cities do not contain information about whether equipment purchases by contract cities are allowed. This means the Sheriff may not be able to review or reject items that could present risks. For example, contract cities could buy equipment like specialty vehicles that officers might not have appropriate training to operate, but the Sheriff does not currently have a way to ensure those risks are mitigated. So we are recommending that the Sheriff document agreements with its contract city partners to make the process for approval of high-risk items explicit. The next set of safeguards we looked at relate to tracking. Tracking means having good data and conducting regular inventories using that data. The inventory should include a physical check that items are where they're supposed to be and are in working order. And we found that there are some positive tracking practices in place, particularly at the unit level. And I'll talk about an example here. What you see happening on the screen is part of an inventory that the TAC 30 unit regularly conducts for its equipment. The unit uses its own database, and officers go through their equipment, which is what you see here pictured on the screen. And then a sergeant will conduct a physical spot check of some of those items. The unit reported this helps make sure officers have the equipment they are supposed to have, things aren't getting lost, and that the equipment works. Overall, however, we found that those types of practices are not consistent across the organization, so some high-risk items are still at risk of theft, loss, or misuse, and I will highlight 3 examples of practices here. 1, KCSO is procuring a new inventory data system, which will consolidate the dozens of databases that currently exist. But KCSO does not check inventory data against its purchasing data, which means someone could purchase a high-risk item, not add it to the database, and then keep the item for personal use without KCSO knowing. Second, KCSO as an organization does not do regular comprehensive inventories of its high-risk equipment with physical spot checks, like in the SWAT example before. Third, KCSO does not currently track or inventory items purchased by contract cities. These gaps mean KCSO may not have an accurate picture of what high-risk equipment it has, where it is, and whether it's functional, which means it's easier for equipment that fall into those gaps to get lost or stolen and misused. So we make several recommendations to help ensure KCSO can do an effective job tracking its high-risk equipment, including conducting comprehensive physical inventories of its high-risk items, and including contract city items in its data and inventories. Lastly, we found that the asset management role has been scattered across multiple people as part-time duties across the organization. Over time, these responsibilities have been added to the existing duties of various staff, and positions have also been lost. This means that no one has the authority to ensure that KCSO knows what it has, which is contributing to the unreliable data and inconsistent inventory practices we discussed, increasing the risk of loss of high-risk items. So we recommend that the Sheriff's Office define its asset management work and assess its capacity to complete that work effectively. In conclusion, KCSO uses many high-risk items to conduct its work. It does have some safeguards in place, but there are also gaps, and those gaps increase the legal, financial, and safety risks to the county and the public. Our full report was published in May of 2019 and is available online. Thank you.